Have you heard the tale of Scarlet Hazel? She was a lonesome woman that lived in the town not long after its founding. She almost never left her home. She preferred seclusion over having to make conversation with the very talkative townsfolk. Anytime she did have to leave, however, she would dress in all black with a pointed hat, often using the brim to cover her face. This was her method to prevent anyone from approaching or speaking to her. No one knew why she was like this. Was she just a grouchy old lady, or was there something more sinister? Was she hiding a dark secret that even a simple conversation could possibly expose? Little Eddie was about to find out. Eddie was one of Hazel's neighbors, living only a few houses down from her. He spent nearly every day playing outside, and would always spot Hazel on the uncommon occasions that she left her home. Like everyone else, he'd ponder her strange behavior. One night, his curiosity got the best of him. He waited till everyone in his house was sound asleep, and quietly snuck out the back. He traveled through the darkness, and eventually reached the small house that Hazel called home. He began to feel uneasy as he gazed at the front of the house. It was dilapidated, overgrown, with vines ensnaring the exterior, grass and weeds up to his knees. The stone that the house was constructed of was barely visible, almost as if the house was just one giant plant itself. With the lack of lighting on the structure, and the stark silence of the night, save for some crickets, Eddie began to wonder if what he was attempting was an even bigger mistake than it already was. Just then, in the quiet of the night, he heard a noise, and a soft humming coming from behind the house. Following the noise, Eddie began to walk around the house, passing through the shadows, eventually reaching a fence that surrounded the backyard. The fence, like the rest of the house, was overgrown, with its wood rotted and moldy from years of weathering. Eddie eventually found a large hole that he used to peer into the backyard. Shockingly, unlike the rest of the house, the backyard was very well kept. A small candle dimly illuminated the garden to reveal a colorful array of flowers and planters. Behind the garden was the back entrance to the house, with 3 steps leading up to a single door. In the middle of it all stood the mysterious woman herself, Hazel, humming a song as she tended to her beautiful plot. Perhaps the strangest thing to Eddie was seeing Hazel truly happy. Maybe seclusion was all she desired. There wasn't much for her to hide. This is what Eddie concluded, before he was proven dead wrong. As Hazel began walking up to the steps to the door, Eddie noticed Hazel cringe and take a step back, looking down at her feet. She seemed to have stepped on a spider. "Oh, you poor thing," he heard her broken-heartedly say to the spider's corpse. "Here, let me help you." Just then, Hazel's fingers began to wiggle like worms, as she began to speak an incantation Eddie couldn't understand. He couldn't tell if she was even speaking English. Just then, the spider sprung back to life as if nothing had happened, only before it began to grow and grow and grow. The black and red spider was 10 times bigger than before. Eddie was horrified by what he just witnessed. He couldn't believe a witch was living in his town. Frozen in fear, he began to yell, "Witch! Witch!" This alarmed Hazel. She fearfully looked around to see who was yelling. Eddie began to run into the neighborhood. Hearing his footsteps from the other side of the fence, Hazel hastily departed through the fence door, and upon spotting Eddie, her fear quickly turned to rage. "You brat!" she yelled as she quickly caught up to Eddie, grabbing him while he began screaming for help. Hazel put up one of her hands, pointed at Eddie, and began to mutter another spell in a strange tongue. Her eyes began to glow a bright milky white. Just then, Eddie felt something move up through his throat. He began to feel the sharp object poking around his mouth. All of a sudden, a needle with some thread tied at the end of it burst through his upper lip. Hazel then grabbed the needle and used it to sew Eddie's mouth shut. Then, another needle popped out from under his right eye. Hazel began sewing both of his eyes shut as well. Finally, one more needle popped out beside Eddie's nose, which Hazel then used to sew his nostrils shut. Finished with her work, Hazel let go of Eddie, who was frantically grasping at his neck. His breathing passages completely sealed. Hazel cackled as Eddie dropped to the floor, his skin turning blue from the lack of air, before he went limp. A large grin stretched across the witch's face as she let out another loud cackle before retreating to her backyard, then into her house, making sure her new pet followed her in. The next morning, Hazel awoke to the smell of smoke. It wasn't long before she realized her house was engulfed in flames. While attempting to find an exit, Hazel grabbed a few of her belongings, including her pet spider, her pointed hat, and a small clown doll, which was given to her by her mother that passed away when she was a young girl. She noticed the back door seemed like the safest way out. Avoiding flames in the collapsing structure of the house, Hazel reached the door and opened it, successfully escaping her smoldering domicile. Upon entering the backyard, Hazel was horrified by the state of her garden. The once green grass now burned to a dark black. The colorful flowers cut from their stems, her crops like her pumpkins smashed with their guts and seeds strewn throughout the lawn. Hazel couldn't bear to stare at her vandalized garden any longer. She quickly exited through the gate and around the side of the house. Reaching the front yard, there stood a large mob, each person carrying a torch or pitchfork. "There she is!" a woman in the crowd yelled. "That's the woman who murdered my son!" Hazel quickly turned around and ran, heading towards the forest at the edge of town. Upon entering, she waited for the mob to draw closer before speaking another incomprehensive spell, before the entire mob was pushed back, many toward the front falling to the ground. Hazel began to speak. "Follow me, and I shall lead you to your demise!" She then let out a loud cackle before vanishing into the woods. After walking for many miles, Hazel came across a large weeping willow tree, which she would call her new home from then on. Deep within the woods and protected by the curse she placed upon it, no one was to ever encroach upon her again. That is until over a century later. Hazel, sitting on a tree stump, was startled by loud bangs in the distance. Upon coming to, a herd of deer zoomed past her. A hunter was near. Hazel tilted her hat down, the brim of her hat obscuring her face. The hunter, pursuing the deer, drew closer and closer. Suddenly, he noticed Hazel. "Hey lady, what you doing out here?" he asked, a southern drawl in his voice. Hazel then lifted her hat to reveal her horrifying visage to the hunter. Using her magic, Hazel was able to lengthen her lifespan for as long as she pleased, but at the cost of being unable to alter her appearance. The passing years had turned her skin a mucus green, covered in many wrinkles, her eyes now purely white, her irises and pupils completely gone. She grinned at the man, revealing a mouthful of missing teeth, with the remaining ones reduced to rotting, jagged stubs. Frightened, the hunter aimed his gun at Hazel, ready to shoot, when suddenly, Hazel's giant spider descended from a web down onto the hunter. The spider sunk its 2 large fangs into the man's neck, paralyzing him with its venom. He fell to the ground, dropping his gun. The spider then retreated to Hazel. "You know, I could use a guard dog," Hazel said, petting her enlarged arachnid. Hazel muttered yet another spell. The hunter regained consciousness, before he began to writhe on the ground in pain, his bones cracking as he began to metamorphosize into a wolf-like beast. His face extended into a snout as his teeth fell out, sharp canine teeth emerging from his gums. His ears grew long and pointed as the pigment of his skin changed to a light gray, and brown and white fur began to cover his body. His nails turned black as they grew into long, sharp claws. With the transformation complete, the wolfman growled as he stood up, nearly losing his balance like a dog standing on its hind legs. His glowing yellow eyes made contact with Hazel's as she cackled at her creation. "You are to find anyone who trespasses," Hazel ordered the beast. "You may do what you please with them." The wolf snarled at Hazel before vanishing into the woods. Hazel then turned to her spider once again. "I've been thinking. It may be time to apologize to someone." Hazel snapped her fingers, and the spider climbed up the willow tree. The spider then dropped back down on a web, holding the clown doll Hazel escaped her previous home with. She pointed at the doll as her eyes began to glow. "Wakey, wakey, little Eddie." Should you enter Hazel Hollow, know that you've just placed your fate in the hands of the wicked Willow Witch.